Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'm speaking with my friend Kerry Kennedy of the Robert and Ethel Kennedy Center for Human Rights. This is a project of beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and regular Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus and practicing nonviolence and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So let's begin with a little prayer. So I invite everyone, wherever you are, just to take a deep breath and to relax and to recenter yourself. And together, let's all enter into the presence of the God of peace who loves us all infinitely and personally. And let's welcome the risen, nonviolent Jesus here with us. And just take a moment to ask for whatever grace you need to follow Jesus more faithfully and do God's will. God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life, love, and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect together on your call to work for a more nonviolent, more just world, and in doing so to follow the nonviolent Jesus. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, heal us, strengthen us, and send us out to do your will, to do our part to help end poverty, violence, racism, greed, injustice, execution, gun violence, permanent warfare, nuclear weapons, and environmental destruction, that we might be your beatitude people, your holy peacemakers, and welcome your reign of universal love, nonviolence, and peace on earth. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, everyone, it's a great blessing to welcome my friend Kerry Kennedy, president of the Robert and Ethel Kennedy Center for Human Rights, which you can all visit and learn about at www.kennedyhumanrights.org. A lifelong human rights activist and lawyer, Kerry authored Being Catholic Now, as well as Speak Truth to Power, and another great book, Robert F. Kennedy, Ripples of Hope, and is the author of the forthcoming book about her mother, my friend Ethel Kennedy, The Extraordinary Life and Bold Legacy. Kerry is the seventh of Ethel and Robert Kennedy's 11 children and has devoted more than 40 years to the pursuit of equal justice, the protection of human rights all around the world. She's led literally hundreds of human rights delegations and comments regularly on television. For 10 years, she served as chair of the Amnesty International USA Leadership Council. She's a graduate of Boston College Law School and lives in Massachusetts. Kerry Kennedy, welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast.
Well, it's always great to be with you, John, so thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you. Well, it's...
John, I'm talking to you today from Assisi, where I just went to visit one of my best friends in the Catholic Church, St. Francis. And they pull his bones up from the crypt once every 100 years, and they're putting it back down on Sunday. So I did this pilgrimage to come and see him. I know you've been here many, many times, but the things he stood for are exactly what you're talking about. Peace and justice and nonviolence towards one another. And so it's really beautiful to be speaking to you and meaningful to be speaking to you in particular, because that's how you committed your life.
Oh, thanks, Kerry. I'm very moved that you're making the holy pilgrimage to Assisi, Italy, at this time in the world and all that we're all going through. So you want to say a little bit about St. Francis, the peacemaker, and how he inspires you? Let's start off on a happy, positive note.
Well, I think like so many others, I met St. Francis when I was a child, because, of course, we always think of him as the saint of the animals. And almost any Catholic garden you go in will have a little statue of St. Francis holding a bird or a squirrel and a couple of rabbits around his feet. And indeed, we had that at my home in McLean, Virginia, where I grew up, Hickory Hill. And again, in Hyannisport, where if you just dig a little down, you will find about 100 cats, dogs, squirrels,
Oh, wow.
gerbils,
Wow.
all sorts of things, hawks, owls, etc. But as I grew older and became more curious about his actual life, he grew up in extraordinary wealth, and he was riding his horse one day, and he saw a leper. And he was disgusted by the leper, but something inside him said, "Go and be with this man." And he got off his horse and he went over and he kissed this man's hands. And that was a transformative moment of him. And it was the grace of Jesus Christ speaking through him and saying that people who are on the outside, people who have nothing, are closest to God. And Jesus gave his life to us. Not through the rich, not through the powerful, not through gold, but through poverty. And so when we give ourselves away, that's when we have the most. And that's my understanding of him in a nutshell.
Oh, that's so wonderful. I never got to tell you, but after 9/11, which I was very involved with as coordinator of chaplains, a couple of friends and I, Franciscans, whom you would know, wrote this. I shouldn't tell you this. Wrote a movie script about Saint Francis meeting the Sultan, because we were trying to deal with
I love that story.
Yeah,
yes, exactly.
With Francis and Muslims, and we thought that would help. And to me, that was the great accomplishment of his life, that he walked into this war zone. He spent 7 months walking through dead bodies like Gettysburg, and met with the Sultan, who thought, well, if all Christians are like this, I'll become a Christian practically. It was on the way back, Richard Rohr told me, that the Crusaders, led by the Cardinal, wanted to kill Francis. So we made a movie about that, and we were working with your aunt, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Remember, she had done the movie on Mary, and then she was really interested in making it an ABC TV movie of the week, but it didn't happen. That's a little footnote for you. Okay, Kerry, tell me how you got into all of this. I know that's a kind of a ridiculous question, but you've become a real leading voice in the world for human rights. How did that journey begin?
You're so kind. Well, first of all, my father was Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, not to be confused with my brother of the same name, but during the height of the civil rights movement. And so my earliest memories are going to the Justice Department with him and my brothers and sisters, and always a few dogs and all of that sort of thing. And we always had, my parents really didn't separate Daddy's office life from their home life. So we often went to visit him in the office, and likewise, he was always bringing civil rights activists, indigenous activists, people from the farm workers movement and others to our house. And that's really the way I grew up. So when I learned to tie my shoes at whatever that is, 5 or 6, I made sure that if I put my left shoe on first, I tied my right shoe first, because I want there to be fairness and justice and no favoritism and nobody being the outcast. So,
wow,
where do you get that from? That's
intense.
That's from the values.
Yeah, your parents.
A child gets that from the values around their home. And then when I was about 20, I took a summer internship at Amnesty International. This is about 1980, 1981. And I was documenting abuses committed by U.S. immigration officials against refugees from El Salvador. And, so people are kind of wondering, scratching their heads, saying, where did all this violence of ICE come from? Well, it's not from one president, and it's not from one party, and it's not going to disappear with one president or one party. It's going to disappear when the people of the United States say, this does not reflect our values and our vision of who we are as a country. We understand that there are more people who want to come into our country than our country wants to have here. That's fine, but we're going to put together the resources to have a kind and generous and compassionate process for deciding who comes and who doesn't. And we're not going to round up little children and take them away from their parents and throw them into prison for long periods of time. We're going to stop having extrajudicial killings. We're going to stop torturing people in detention. And we're going to stop these abuses. So that's what I'm working on now.
So let me ask you then about the center, which you changed the name recently to the Robert and Ethel Kennedy Center for Human Rights. And I think it's been going for over 40 years now, but as you know, I worked for your family as a kid. When I was 20, I was the personal assistant to the director, David Hackett, your father, Bobby Kennedy's best friend. And it was called the RFK Memorial then, as I recall, in 81. And I had a quote on the wall, which was the memorial slogan from your father, which I see now as you use as a kind of a mission for the center. And here's this great quote from your father. "Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so long ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world." I see that quote on the Robert and Ethel Kennedy Center for Human Rights website up front and center. So I would really like you to take your time and tell everybody about the work of the center, because it's always amazed me.
That's so nice. Thank you. Well, of course, this was started in 1968 by my father's family and friends to carry forward his unfinished work on social justice. The primary mover, shaker, founder, person who gave birth to it was my mom. And she died a year and a half ago. Of course, you were there presiding at her funeral, and for which I am endlessly grateful, John. And so when she passed, we decided to rename the organization that she devoted her life to after her as well. So now it's Robert and Ethel Kennedy Human Rights Center. We do three things. First, we sue governments that are abusing human rights. Domestically, we have about 30 lawsuits at any given time against right now against the Trump administration. Our aim is to decrease mass incarceration, and we do that through the lens of discrimination, racial discrimination in law enforcement. So arrests, extrajudicial killings by police against Black and brown people primarily, and abuses committed by ICE while people are detained. And that's the use of torture and the other abuses that happen in detention. So that's domestically. Internationally, we have about 40 cases at any given time, a lot of them on women's rights, stopping violence against women, or stopping violence against Indigenous people, all marginalized people. And civic space. Civic space is the ability to criticize your government without fear of repercussions. So we're doing that. We have about 40 cases at any given time, and we've never lost a case.
Wow.
And yeah, so I'm really, really proud of our team. And all of these cases are like Brown v. Board for their countries.
Yeah.
When you win a case in these international fora, you win on behalf of the family of the victim, of course. So there's usually a payout to that family. But there is institutional changes that take place. So we won a case a few years ago about violence against women in Guatemala. The president of the country had to come to a press conference and formally take responsibility for the killing of this woman.
Wow.
In front of the nation and make a payout to the family. But then they had to put up streetlights in 6 cities. They had to process over 2,000 rape crisis kits. They had to hire women police officers, which they hadn't had before. They had to hire victim witness advocates, which they had never had before. They had to train judges, police, and prosecutors in domestic violence cases. So you have typically about a dozen different things that the government has to do to assure this type of violation, whatever it is, in whatever country it is, never happens again. So that's called strategic litigation. So that's what we do. So one is strategic litigation, domestic and foreign. Second is we work with Wall Street, with the investment industry, to put downward pressure on the companies they invest in to assure that those companies are in compliance with human rights norms. And third, we train the next generation of leaders, kindergarten through law school.
Wow.
So that's what we're doing.
That's fantastic. You won't remember, but we had lunch about 25 or 30 years ago in Manhattan. And I remember saying to you, tell me about the work. And we were talking about the awards that you give out. And you said one of the things, and I want you to talk about it, as I recall, was you try to identify the key voices in countries around the world. And you would go there sometimes with your mom and give an R.F. Kennedy award to kind of highlight a Dorothy Day or Martin Luther King type person in a remote corner of Africa or something like that. And you were trying to go around the world to do that and bring the Kennedy name and spotlight on it. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Memory. We still do that. So we give a book award, a journalism award, and human rights awards. And those are to people who expose injustice and to people who are the Martin Luther Kings and Mahatma Gandhis of their countries, people who face imprisonment, torture, and death. For basic human rights, for the protection of dignity. And these are the real heroes of their communities. But, first of all, you don't need a passport to find these people. They're in our country as well, and they're all around us, of course. And they are exactly who we need at this time in our nation's history and in our world's history, because they are people who have faced extraordinary oppression, who have overcome their fear in out of loving service to their community. And that's what we're going to need to depend on in order to protect and preserve our democracy and to assure that for our families, for our communities, for our neighbors, for our country, that we live in a place where people recognize one another's dignity and where governments treat people with dignity.
You have traveled so much, so many nations, and supported so many movements and struggles and leaders of justice and human rights around the planet. I've traveled a lot, but I don't know how you do it. And after all these decades, you must have so many stories and the wonderful holy people you've met around the world. Maybe some have been killed. I, I would love to ask you to talk about one or two, but I think we should start with El Salvador, because as I recall, you went there last year to see for yourself the horrific prison that the Trump administration has been sending hundreds of people to. I don't think you got in. You know, I lived there in 1985, so I'm very close to Salvador. Can you tell me a little bit about that trip?
Sure. So the Trump administration, it was known that they were planning to, they had rounded up several hundred men and accused them of being gang members. And were about to fly them to El Salvador. And a judge in the United States put a stop order on those flights, saying you are not allowed to do that. And despite that order, the Trump administration illegally sent all of these men to the famous CCOT prison. Now, this is a prison in El Salvador that's reserved as particularly for extremely violent gang members in El Salvador. The Trump administration sent 200 people, over 200, almost 300 people who were originally from Venezuela, had escaped the Venezuelan government, Maduro, come to the United States seeking a better life in the land of the free and the home of the brave. And then when we're rounded up, many of them who had immigration papers, who were legally here, and sent them to this horrific prison in El Salvador where they were tortured, they were humiliated, and they were subjected to horrific conditions. So within 2 or 3, I think it was 3 days of that happening, I found myself with our team of lawyers on a plane to San Salvador to go and attempt to see our clients, and then to speak to survivors of the CCOT prison, to start to investigate the conditions there, to meet with government officials and demand access to our clients, and then to speak with human rights defenders, some of the most extraordinary human beings who are on the front lines of human rights defense there.
Well, thank you so much, Kerry. I wonder if there's one other place or story you'd like to tell. I know of your longtime involvement with Haiti. I know about South Africa. But there's so many places. Is there any one story you'd like to tell me or point out?
We've been really blessed to work all over the world. But I'll tell you this story about a fellow called Sam Kofi Woods. He was from Liberia, and he grew up in the worst slum I've ever seen. It's a slum that you see in many parts of the world, with tin shacks and no electricity and no water, plumbing, none of that. But this grew out from the streets of Monrovia, which is right at the capital city, and it sits on the ocean. So this slum had grown out onto the sand and down to the beach. So whenever there was a high tide and a full moon, the waves would come up and sweep whole neighborhoods away. I mean, it was just amazing. And that's where he grew up. And he was kind of recognized by a priest who took him in and got him to go to the the Catholic school there, and he came to know the cardinal, who was an extraordinarily courageous guy called Cardinal Francis. And the cardinal had a radio station, and the cardinal was the only voice standing up to the dictator in Liberia. So now Kofi, at about age 16, said that he would like to go on the radio and do a little radio show about human rights. So the cardinal said yes, he could do that. He's in the middle of the broadcast, and these three thugs walk into the radio station as he's broadcasting, and they kidnap him. It is the Attorney General, the Minister of Justice for the country, and his two, henchmen. And they torture him, and they throw him into a horrific prison, which, P.S., I have been to, so I know what I'm talking about here. Underground, no lights, horrible, horrible conditions. And they leave him there, and, that's going to be the end of him. Well, he escaped, and he got himself to the United States with the help of the church, and he graduated from college, and then he graduated from Columbia Law School. And then there was a changeover of governments in Liberia. And he goes back to Liberia. And he goes back to that very same prison cell that he had escaped from. And who's in that prison cell but the Minister of Justice and the two thugs? And he walks into it, and they say, "You're here to kill us." And he said, "No, I'm here to defend you. Because if you can get a fair trial, then we will have a fair system of justice in this country. So I'm going to defend you."
What a story. What a story.
Wow.
Did you get to meet him?
Yes. I, in fact, saw him a couple of months ago.
Wow. Well, thank you for that story. So I want to ask you about the night Dr. King was killed and your father's famous speech. One of the blessings of my life was knowing your mother so well and Mrs. King, and being able to tell them that the death of your father and Dr. King changed my life, and it led to me to become a priest and start all this. You know my story. But, so your father was on the campaign trail in Indianapolis on April 4th. He announces the awful news to the crowd and gives what some have called the best speech in U.S. history, certainly his greatest speech. And I want to read a quote from it, because it's had so much impact on me, and I don't know that we've ever talked about it, and just ask you to share whatever you want about it and what it means for us today, why it's so important. So here's what your father said on April 4th, 1968. "What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country."
Yeah, so beautiful.
So beautiful.
I mean, so beautiful and spontaneous words.
Yeah.
He was, as you say, he was campaigning, and he was on an airplane, and he heard that Dr. King had been wounded. And then when the plane landed, he in Indianapolis, he was told that Dr. King had been killed. And my mother was with him. My mother was pregnant with my sister Rory, the youngest of us. They had 10 other children, and my mother was pregnant. And the mayor of the city said, "You can't go to that neighborhood. It's too dangerous. Cities are going up in flames across the country, and you can't go there." And John Lewis Congressman John Lewis, future Congressman John Lewis, was working for my father's campaign, and he was organizing the Black community. And he said, come. And my father knew, had been working in communities like this one. He knew and trusted John, and he said, I'm going. And he got to this, it was the largest Black community in Indianapolis. And most of the people had been there for hours, so they hadn't heard the news. And then some people had heard the news and came ready to riot. And my father, told them that their great hero had been killed by a white man. And he spoke for the first time about his own brother's death. And he said, my brother was also killed by a white man. And I know this feeling, and the anger and the rage and the instinct to lash out. But this is not what we need in our country now. And that night, 127 cities went up in flames in the United States, and Indianapolis remained peaceful. Yeah. And then the next day he canceled all of his campaign stops except for one, because the next day the headlines across the country were, the Black communities have rioted, and now we owe them nothing. And my father wanted to counter that messaging. And so he went to the Cleveland City Club, this kind of part of white power. And he said, you built this system. Your power derives from the suffering of others. And you gave people no other choice but to stand up and riot. What else could they do? They cannot get your attention. And so you need to, focus on schools and on jobs, and imagine the violence of the street, of a gun in the night, but also imagine the violence of sending a kid to a school without books, and a man to a job that doesn't pay enough to pay the rent for his family. And the horror of that, and that's the system you set up. So that's what we have to address. It's a really fantastic speech, really an extraordinary speech. I highly recommend it, Cleveland City Club. And then he came home to Hickory Hill. And I remember that day, because all of us, my brothers and sisters and my mom, we were all watching television. And in our house, we had one big TV. And whoever the rule was, because we had 10 siblings, the rule was whoever turns it on gets to decide what to watch. But they could be trumped by anybody who wants to watch the news. So we watch the news all the time, because So we were watching the news, and my father came in, and he was wearing like a T-shirt and shorts because he didn't have to go to work that day, and he was going to go play football with us. And we were watching Washington burn. Washington was 10 minutes from our house. Yeah. And he turned around, went back upstairs, came back down. And he was wearing a suit. He gave us a kiss. He walked out the door. 10 minutes later, or 15 minutes later, we're all still watching the news. And there's my father, right in the middle of the flames, trying to stop the riots, trying to bring peace to people.
Thank you.
I mean, that's it, John. That is walking into the flames when our country's on fire. And you know what? Our country's on fire today, and all of us have to walk into the flames. That's our job.
Thank you for telling me that story. That morning I was 9 years old, and my father was the head of the National Press Club. I lived not far from you growing up. And my father said, "Okay, John." And he took me in the car and he drove me down. And we spent the afternoon driving around the riots. And my father said, "You're never to forget this. I want you to do something about this." So that your father was in the neighborhood too. It's very moving. So you also mentioned your mother was there in Indianapolis. And I'm really excited to read your forthcoming book about your mother. And as you heard, to the listeners, just full disclosure, I was a very close friend of Ethel Kennedy's and saying Mass at her house every 2 or 3 months, the last 10 years of her life. And she was one of my best friends, but I think a lot of her friends thought that, Kerry. Tell us a little bit about your forthcoming book and how she inspired you in this great work.
Thank you. That's so kind. Well, what is first of all, my mother, it really is living history because she
Yeah.
was so much engaged, and she wasn't the typical 1960s wife where the husband goes off and does stuff and the wife stays home. No, she was fully involved, and she was campaigning, and she was going on all the trips with him, and they were very much a partnership. But the thing I think is super interesting about her, and this, she 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 had such a tough life in so many ways. I mean, from the outside, it was very glamorous and very, without needs. But she had 3 brothers who were extremely violent and really very, very scary. Her parents both died in a plane accident when she was 27 years old, and she had 6 kids. She lost her husband when she had 10 children, and she was pregnant with the 11th, and by a guy who shot 5 people that night. I mean, the fact that she wasn't killed is a miracle, a miracle. And living through that trauma and coming out of that trauma and then trying to raise 10, 11 traumatized children was this powerhouse of faith. And she walked through life with so much joy and love and service to others throughout her entire life. She died at 96 in her last few years. The phrase that she said more than any other was, "Aren't we lucky? Aren't we lucky?" You'd say, "Look, it's a sunny day." Yes, aren't we lucky? Look at those beautiful clouds moving in. Aren't we lucky? Just that, the beautiful. So how do you go through life? Trauma is part of all of our lives. If you live, you're going to experience trauma. And God doesn't protect us from trauma, but he never leaves us in the midst of our trauma. And that's what she believed. And she always felt close, very, very, very close to her faith. And she always felt this extraordinary sense of joy. And it wasn't shallow. It's not that she didn't know, or feel the danger and the terror and the fear and the sadness. Of course she felt all that. Of course she experienced all that. But she was not going to let that stop her in her own fearlessness.
Thank you for all of that. And so moving to hear you say all that. For me, I'm not going to get into it, but she confided all of that to me. She told me her whole life. And I got to pray with her for many, many years and laugh and kid around. And she made fun of me and I made fun of her. And then we'd have Mass and then she'd tell me about Nelson Mandela or something. And but it was all joy. And even as tough things were happening, and she knew about what I've been working on and all. So she was such a great inspiration to all those of us who knew and loved her. About to your father again, you put together a great book of quotes and reflections and speeches called Ripple of Hope, which is based on another, maybe his greatest quote from South Africa in 1986, So I want to read that to you because it's so beautiful.
Yes, 1966.
1966, you're right.
Yes. Yeah.
And when I guess both your parents went to South Africa, which was such a prophetic act. And it's about the ripple of hope, and I just want to ask you to comment about that, given this tough time. So here's your father's words in South Africa in 1966. Each time a person stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, those ripples build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance. Again, Kerry, I had that on my wall in the office next to David Hackett, the RFK Memorial, and
beautiful.
I read it every day and then became a Jesuit, and it's been like a guiding statement for me. Tell us about that. It's so beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, that was an extraordinary moment because, of course, he had been Attorney General at the height of the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, and he recognized the parallels between what was happening in our own country and the white supremacists that were running apartheid South Africa. And he wanted to show up and to be there to listen to people locally, to see what they had to say, to learn about their vision for the future, and specifically to talk to the young people. And so he went and spoke at universities across South Africa. And of course, that culminated with his remarks at the University of Cape Town. And some of which you just read. Incidentally, that is also another speech that's really, for your listeners, worthwhile looking up. It's called Day of Affirmation Speech, Robert F. Kennedy, South Africa, 1966.
It's wonderful, wonderful. So, Kerry, maybe I begin to wrap it up, but I have two other questions and see what you think. So we're all going through such turmoil in our country and the world. Many people marching, protesting, resisting the Trump administration's wars, especially the current war with Israel on Iran and Lebanon, but also Ukraine, supporting wars in Ukraine and Congo and South Africa and everywhere, it seems, Syria and Afghanistan. But the nuclear threats and dismantling environmental protections and cuts in basic human resources for the poor, such as food, healthcare, and housing, and suppressing voting rights, promoting white supremacy, and basically where it seems to me we're moving out of democracy into dictatorship and in permanent global warfare. I know we don't have to talk about it, but your brother, Bobby, whom I know a little bit, is leading the Trump administration on all these cuts in healthcare. I wondered if you had any thoughts about all of that and resisting all of that, or if you want to say anything to us about that. Your brother or the administration or just the whole thing?
Well, as to my brother, it's a great gift of Catholicism because Catholicism teaches us at such a young age that you can hold together in your hands two opposing thoughts, two opposing things that are both true. He's alive, but he's dead. He's buried, but he's risen. And there is just so much of that happens in the Catholic Church. All saints are also sinners. How can all these things be true at the same time? And, I am grateful for all of those lessons because I love my brother with all my heart. I surely do. And I completely disagree with him on almost everything he says. That's not science-based. So I think, that's part of the gift of being in a very large family, as you also learn at a young age to get along with people who are irritating to you.
Kerry,
So that's a good thing. And we need to do that because we need now more than ever to treat people who we disagree with, to recognize we're all part of the same community. And we need to find ways of seeing the God in each of us, the love in each of us, the potential in each of us, and to not give up on that.
You framed your answer in light of growing up Catholic, and you wrote a book once called Being Catholic Now, and you know about my work, especially to promote the nonviolence of Jesus. Would you share with us any thought you have these days about the nonviolent Jesus, or finding strength in the Gospels, and thus in the God of peace, and I suppose in our religious communities?
Yeah, I just...
Well, you're in Assisi, for one thing.
I mean, first of all, here I am in Assisi. I you know, I think the words that ring most true to me in the Bible are love one another. Love one another. And I think, whenever we're in trouble, whenever we're wondering what to do next, just that's kind of what I go back to and say, is this decision, which way is more about loving one another? How do we do that? So, I mean, I fail at it again and again and again. I fail at it 50 times a day, but I try. And that's where I'm at on that.
That is
But
great.
I think
Yeah.
I'd just like to say this, John. Not all of us are given to be the president or be the king or be the wizard, but we all have ways of making our world better, of making our country better. If you're a teenager and you're listening to this, go home, cook dinner for your family tonight, or wash all the dishes without being asked. You can do something to make things better for somebody. Help somebody who doesn't have a home. Go buy them socks. Go do something for somebody.
That's a really good note to
go
end on.
out and vote. Vote, vote, vote. If you want to change our country, you have to vote. And a very important vote is coming up in November, and get all your friends to vote. Go on social media, say what you need to say, but that can't be the end of it. You can't say, I've done my part now. You got to vote, and you got to march, and you got to be in there, and you got to listen to John Deere.
Kerry Kennedy, thank you so much for being with me all the way from Assisi, Italy, and say a prayer for me and all of us at the tomb of St. Francis, and I wish you every blessing. Thanks for speaking with me today, Kerry. And thanks, friends, for listening to this episode of the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. You can hear more podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at www.beatitudecenter.org, and sign up to receive our free e-blast with news about upcoming podcasts and Zooms. And please tell all your friends and coworkers about this podcast. And a little plug, I hope you all get my new book, Universal Love, Surrendering to the God of Peace. So may the God of peace bless you all, and may we all keep on following the nonviolent Jesus and do what we can to work for a more just, more nonviolent country and world. God bless you. See you next time.